So today we're going to take a look at step 3, and next week we're going to spend 2 sessions on step 3. My website has many resources on it that could be quite helpful to you, herbk.com. Step 3. Well, you know it. I'm going to unpack it word by word, line by line. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. We know it, we've read it, we've talked about it. Step 3. I see it in 2 parts. Today I'm going to talk about the first part, alignment. That word's not in the big book, but it is my word to describe the purpose of step 3, the commitment of step 3. There's no action in step 3 other than praying a prayer that's suggested on page 63 of the big book. The material on step 3 is pages 58 to 63. I'm going to cover 58 to 62 today, and then in 2 weeks I'll cover from 62 through 63, just those 2 pages. But they're just dense in terms of their instruction, in terms of their suggestion, in terms of the implication. Pages 58 to 62 are about alignment. Pages 62 to 63 is about relationship. That word's not in the big book. So I'm going to be talking to you about my interpretation of the big book using words that are not in the big book. Bill said it earlier. We know only a little, more will be revealed. And these are the words that I use to capture the essence of and the purpose of step 3. That's why that set-aside prayer is so important. If you have any negativity or any resistance to what I've just shared, take a deep breath and just listen openly. You do not have to agree with me. You can actually actively disagree with me. That's okay, but I want you to understand what you're agreeing or disagreeing. We had an experience with step 1. I brought you through the teaching in the big book that we have a body problem and a mind problem and a will problem. A body problem in addiction, the allergy and the craving. A mind problem in the obsession and the delusion and the insanity. It'll be different this time. But I stressed, and I hope you got it, unmanageability is the real problem. Addiction's a problem. It's just not the problem. The big book suggests that in many places. Addiction is a symptom of the problem. The real problem is lack of power. And we looked at that in step 2. Lack of power is our dilemma, reflecting the bedevilments that we looked at in unmanageability. The bedevilments that still keep us in prison. And we have tried all of the traditional mechanisms and some untraditional to get free, self-help and therapy and even a 12-step program, and we're not free. We're restless, irritable, and discontent because we're holding the bars up and there's no ceiling, there's no walls, there's no floor. But we don't know that we don't know, and we don't know that we're free except for the fact that we've placed ourselves in prison. That brings us to step 2, that I need a power, not only to do better, but to know better. I need a power to know better and then to do better. A decision about power, that's our step 2. You made the decision. That last gathering that we had with me as your facilitator, the final question was, well, what do you want and need as a power? The big book has some suggestions, but it says it's your choice. Page 53. God is or God isn't, power is or power isn't, light is or light isn't. What's your choice? You name it. What's power to you? Is it available? What do you need? What do you want? Step 3 is real clear. Now I'm going to take it apart. Made a decision. Well, it's very similar to what I suggested was the heart of step 2. It doesn't say it in the big book as clearly as I say it. Page 53 says, God is or God isn't. What is your choice? Now, if you spend some time taking that apart, it's about a decision, but it's a decision about God. Step 3 is a decision for God, a turning. What does that mean? Turning. Bill says on page 14, as part of his story, at the very top of the page, page 14, simple but not easy. A price has to be paid. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness, that unmanageability that we looked at, the behavioral description on page 52, the bedevilments, the essence and nature of the bedevilments, the source of the bedevilments, pages 60 to 62, unmanageability. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. Why? That's a pretty active term. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. Bill gives us that hint right up front of step 3. Turning. Our will and our lives. Well, what does that mean to us? There's many interpretations. It doesn't matter what your interpretations are. But think about it. We turn our will and our lives. There's so many awkward and perhaps even just unfortunately wrong interpretations of what step 3 is. To turn our will and our lives. What do we mean by will? What do we mean by life? I don't know. Bill doesn't tell us. Perhaps our will is our ability to make a choice, our free will to choose. He emphasized that in step 2. Perhaps our life are the consequences of those decisions. My will is what I choose. My life is the outcome. Over to the care of God. There's where the rubber meets the road. So many times people talk about step 3, leaving out the word care. Turn our will and our lives over to God. I'm sorry if you have that and you disagree with me, but that's okay. We don't turn our will and our lives over to God. That's not what it says. We turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. My very layman's interpretation, God gave us our will and our life. God does not want it back. Turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. We'll be talking more about that. What does it mean? Simply put, and perhaps placing this as a thought that we can explore together here, it's kind of like the GPS. It's a great metaphor for this step. I hear so many speakers say, give God the keys, let God be the driver, let God manage your life. And I just get apoplectic. That's not it at all. It's my car. They're my keys. I own the car. I know how to drive it. I have a driver's license and I have insurance. And I know where I want to go. I just don't know how to get there. Sometimes I don't know where to go, but let's assume that I know where to go and I don't know how to get there. Well, I get in my car. I use my keys to turn it on. I use my ability to drive the car. I know where I want to go. I don't know how to get there. So I put the address in the GPS and then I listen to the GPS and I follow direction. I do believe that's a wonderful, powerful metaphor for us today. To listen to direction, to follow direction, to make course corrections when in fact we discover that we're not actually following directions, we're following our interpretation of directions. As we understood God. What does that mean? Of course, we can't understand God. Any God that I understand is not big enough because I'm finite, it's infinite. We covered that in step 2. Bill asks us on, I think it's page 60, we'll come to it in a minute. Well, what do we mean by that and what do we do? He has these wonderful, powerful questions that if we ask it, literally, intelligently, consciously, at the beginning of where he puts the question, it helps us unpack his suggestions following the questions. What do we mean? What do we do? Now, here's where I come to the word alignment. It's not in the book. I've mentioned that. But I was sitting with a young man, 24 years old, Kevin, in a treatment center. They had brought me in to do some work with the young people in the program there with regard to the steps as well as the spiritual dimensions of the steps. And he made it really clear. He said, Herb, this is my 8th treatment center, inpatient. I'm 24 years old. I have a lot of information. I don't want to hear from you anything about 12-step. I don't want to hear anything about God, about sponsorship, about meetings, about spirituality. Good Lord, he just wiped out my vocabulary and my experience. So I took a breath, paused, and went very quickly into a place of encounter with what I consider to be that spirit. And I said, I want to help this young man. Give me the words and give me the voice. And so I said, Kevin, do you believe in a life force? I had come out of some work with Dr. Berger where he talks about the organismic life force. It's a great ambiguous metaphor for God as we don't understand it. I said, do you believe in the life force, like Star Wars, may the force be with you? He says, oh yeah, absolutely. I believe in the universe, there's an energy, there's a life force. I said, do you believe that you have free will? He said, oh yeah, I can leave this treatment center, as I have many treatment centers, anytime I want. I'm choosing to stay here. I'm choosing to talk to you. A bright young man, very articulate with his own consciousness. So I said, so there is a life force. Look at my hands here now. There's a life force in this universe. And when you're in addiction with your free will, you're going against the life force because it will ruin you physically and emotionally and eventually cause your death. He said, yeah, that's why I'm here. I'm suffering and I'm tired of suffering. I said, so the turning that we talk about here is to place yourself in alignment. I had never said those words before. I never had the concept before. But now I really, truly understand the 3rd step. The 3rd step is a commitment because of my suffering in step 1. And my belief in step 2 that there is a universal life force that is available to me. It's deep down inside of me. It is not me, but it is deep and a resource to me. And I can access it to be in alignment with it. Next week, I'm going to talk about relationship, that other word that's not in the big book. Your assignment is to read pages 62 and 63 and look for the relationships that Bill suggests in the big book. There's 5 of them, 3 of them on page 62, 2 of them, 1 in each paragraph on page 63. Look at those pages again. Look at the promises at the top of the page 63, the promises of step 3. They're phenomenal. The prayer as the second paragraph on step 3. Attempt to write your own prayer based on that prayer. Not to improve it, but to get underneath it and understand it. A fabulous exercise this man gave me going through the steps when I was 10 years sober. Write your own prayer, he said. Not to improve it, but to understand it. When you have to put the words in the book in your own words, then you have to understand the words in the book. I still use the words in the book, but I understand them much more deeply now. So with my free will, I'm choosing to go against the life force. That's unmanageability, and we know that it's not free. Bill said that on page 62. We can't even reduce it much by wishing or trying on our own power. In the same way he talked about our powerlessness and no choice with regard to addiction at the conclusion of his discussion of addiction on page 43, there come a time and a place when we have no mental defense against the first drink, page 43, to do with addiction. On page 62, he addresses unmanageability. We can't even reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. I need help. I need to have my will in alignment with reality. See, that's emotional sobriety at the best. When I'm in alignment with reality, forget the word spirit, forget the word God, forget the word higher power. I mean, they're relevant, but if you have any problem with them, they're not necessary. What is necessary is reality. I live in reality. Well, at least I want to live in reality. Reality just is. I take it personally. The whole point of emotional sobriety is to, number one, recognize that there is a reality. It's immutable and non-negotiable. Immutable. It can't change because of what I want or think or feel. I cannot change reality. I need to adjust and adapt. We're building a spiritual arch, Bill says, a spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom. He started that analogy on page 47 in step 2. He doesn't tell us that obviously step 1 is the foundation, but that's the implication. We have to read between the lines. If in step 2, page 47, he says we're building an arch through which we walk to freedom, and step 2 is the cornerstone. Obviously, we're placing a stone on a foundation. What's the foundation? Oh, the defeat that I've experienced and the surrender that I've engaged in step 1. Surrender's not in the big book. It's a word I use, though, for step 1, not for step 3. Step 3 is not surrender. Well, at least this is my interpretation. And yet you hear it all the time in the rooms, and it sounds good. It just doesn't mean anything. That white flag goes up in step 1. I'm done. Kevin said to me the next week in our conversation, I knew that he'd had an experience as the result of our prior conversation. I said, you're talking differently now. You have a different attitude. What happened? He said, I really saw that I was suffering and I'm tired of suffering. I said, then what? He said, I decided to quit resisting. I said, then what? I decided to take direction. I said, then what? I started actions that I didn't believe in. Contrary actions, things I didn't know and things I didn't want to do. I got a person who had experience that I took direction from. Wow, I have repeated that story 100 times, if I've repeated it once. It's such a powerful description of steps 1, 2, and 3. Bill says step 3 is a decision to turn, and he says it's the keystone, that stone at the top of the arch. That stone at the top of the arch that holds the entire arch together. And the whole benefit of this process is freedom. Walking through this arch. Bill brings it to a conclusion on page 75 when he gives us the promises of step 5 at the conclusion of step 5. We have now walked through the arch to a new freedom. Now, of course, that's an experience that's indicative of the direction. The step 3 promises on page 63, the step 5 promises on page 75, they're not conclusive and final, they're indicative of a direction. In contrast to the promises on pages 83 and 84, which are conclusive. These are our expected outcomes as to finishing the 9th step. So let's take a look at some of the material in page 58. The title of the chapter is How It Works. It drives me nuts when people tell me, oh, I don't know how it works. Well, read the chapter, because it tells us how it works. We may not still understand it all, but we can have an experience with it. It says, if we completely give ourselves to this simple program, there's a whole large paragraph about rigorous honesty. Some people don't really understand what the point is here. It's saying that unless you're willing to be and work toward being rigorously honest, transparent, having your insides and outsides match, you won't get this thing. Now, he warns us, though, in the beginning, and he spends 3 or 4 lines, a couple sentences, saying that there's problems here, because there are some people who are constitutionally incapable of being honest. Look it up. It's probably not you. Constitutional, and he goes on to say, they are not at fault. They have been born that way. Constitution, by their very biology, by their very physiology, by their very psychology, they are not capable. They don't have the capacity for it. Sociopath. Perhaps some form of retardation, some form of trauma and brain damage. Incapable. They don't have the capacity. That's what it means here. Their chances are less than average. Then he treats emotional and mental disorders. After he got through with the biology, he talks about the psychology, emotional and mental, because they have the capacity, some capacity, for rigorous honesty. If you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, and you hear some, what I would consider it kindly as misinformation. Are you willing to go to any length, stand on your head in the corner, or whatever they say in the meetings to try to make the point? I understand the well-intentioned. The big book is very clear about what it means to go to any length. Look at, there's a dash there, page 58. Then you are ready to take certain steps. It's kind of cloaked in ambiguous language until you think about it. You are ready to take certain steps. Oh, that would be steps 4 through 9. If you're willing to go to any length, it means that you will begin with step 4 and you will finish, finish step 9. The step 9 says before you're halfway through, you may experience the change. That's not my experience. I was completely through my 9th step before I became conscious that I had been changed. Now, I had been changing all along. I just wasn't conscious of it. I kept my head down. I kept taking direction. I kept doing the assignments, and I finished my 9th step. And then I paused and looked up around me, and I especially looked back over my shoulder, and I thought, oh, wow, I have been changed, radically changed. Radical, coming from the Latin word radix, which means root. Bill says selfishness, self-centeredness on page 62 is the root of our problem. My root had been tapped and changed as a result of steps 4 through 9. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go. Absolutely. That was the man who said, Herb, you have a lot of information, but you have very little transformation. I had lots of knowledge, but I had never processed it through my heart to my feet, so I had no experience with it. Half measures availed us nothing. Now, I understand the spirit of that. It's just not my experience. By my judgment today, looking back on the first time I went through the steps at 4 years sober, by my experience today, it was a feeble attempt at doing the steps, but it was my first attempt. It was a sincere attempt. I did the best I could, which really wasn't very good by today's standard, but by then it was the best I could do. Please, you perfectionists out there, hear that. We just show up and make the effort, and the results are none of our business. That spiritual advice came from a person not in the program, my own spiritual director. What a relief that was. He said, there's only 2 mistakes that you can make. Not show up and leave early. He was referring to meditation, but I can refer it to my life. I can refer it to the steps. Show up. Do the best you can. Don't leave early. Come back to it. Lean into it gently. There's no violence here. And at the same time, there's no passivity here. I mentioned that step 3 is not a surrender. Step 1 is a surrender. I'm completely defeated by my addiction. I give up. I seek help. I'm completely defeated by my unmanageability at 5 years of sobriety. I give up. Very different experiences, very different process. And in step 3, I make a decision to turn. Listen to the words. It's ferociously active. That word isn't in the big book, ferocious. I don't mean violent. I mean a very focused effort that's consistent, more or less diligent, more or less the best I can do. That's for sure. The best I can do. I'll do better tomorrow. I have hope now, and I know that's true because it's now my experience. A decision to turn. A decision to exercise my free will to take action. As I quoted Bill on page 14. Lest I misquote it. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. I must turn to the light, away from the darkness. Darkness is the absence of light. We made a commitment to the light in step 2. We make a commitment in step 3 to walk toward the light. Step 2 is a decision that it exists deep down inside of me. Step 3 is the commitment to begin a process of identifying and removing the darkness. That's all it is, but that's what it is. We stood at the turning point. We asked. Anytime we're talking to God, we asked. That's a prayer for protection and care with complete abandon. Step 3 has so many absolutes masked in some of the phrases. It doesn't use the term absolute. Bill avoided that term because he didn't want to be connected to the 4 absolutes of the Oxford group. But that's a pretty absolute statement. With complete abandon, can I do that? No, but I can do the best I can and lean gently into it. He lists the steps there. He talks about these are principles that guide our progress, not our perfection, guide our progress. The ABCs, I think interpretation there is really important. Steps 1, 2, and 3. I'm an alcoholic. First half of the first step. I can't manage my life. Second half of the first step. B, no human power. I need a power other than myself. Step 2. C, step 3. That God could, that was covered in step 2. All powerful. And would, that's my decision in step 3. That this is doable, that this is available, that this power is the resource. Because I'm powerless to bring that radical change of the spiritual awakening, which is the promise of step 12. Listen to it. The promise of step 12 is in the step itself. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. It's really that simple, very straightforward. The promised product of the first 9 steps is a spiritual awakening. That's the program of recovery. When we're convinced of that, we're at step 3. Here's the 2 questions now. What do we mean by that? Turning our will and our life over to the care of God. And then what do we do? The next couple pages are all about what do we mean. The first requirement, he's going to explain now. What do I mean, Bill Wilson, in writing this big book? Page 60. The first requirement is that I be convinced that my life run on self-will can hardly be a success. I need to have experienced unmanageability, as he described it in step 1, in step 2, on page 52, the behavioral description of unmanageability, the bedevilments. And quite frankly, in chapter 5, as he describes it on pages 60 to 62. So he's going to give us a description there of what self-will run riot looks like. We may have, if you went through the steps as I have, that third time, looking at this material as part of unmanageability, already had an experience, but now we have in the context of the way Bill introduces it and the way the big book is structured. Even though our motives are good, we're in collision because I don't know that I don't know and I don't see that I don't see. I am trying to be the director. What usually happens, the play doesn't come off very well. I blame other people. The basic problem, he says, is I'm a victim of the delusion that I can wrest satisfaction out of this world. W-R-E-S-T, arm wrestle. Reality, arm wrestle life, arm wrestle with my information and my strong will. I'm going to conquer life. self-development. And we already have the experience that this is not a self-help program, that this is a program for people who really need help, and they have that experience. Page 62. He reminds us, selfishness-self-centeredness is the root of the problem. And down below at the end of that second paragraph, he said, I can't reduce it much by wishing or trying on my own power. I make decisions based on self. Our troubles are of our own making. It sounds fairly negative. Our troubles are of our own making. No, it's just stark, naked reality. My thoughts, my feelings determine my actions. My thoughts are self-centered. My feelings are demented because I misrepresent reality to me, and I don't know that I don't know, and I can't see that I don't see, and I take actions based on that blindness. I have a lot of moral and philosophical convictions galore, moral codes of ethics, principles, philosophical. I have a lot of information, but I'm not able to translate either one into practical actions. And so then he answers the second question, and we'll pick that up next week, 2 weeks. The first question was, well, what do we mean by that? His answer is pages 60 to 62. I'm self-will run riot, and I'm powerless to deal with my unmanageability. Although I have willpower, I have free will, I can't exercise it properly. In step 2, he said on page 53, God is or God isn't, what is your choice? The proper use of the will is God or no God. He said in another context, there is only 2 disciplines in Alcoholics Anonymous. It was the context of the traditions. He says, we don't need any rules or regulations. The traditions are guidelines coming from our experience. The traditions are guardrails coming from our experience. Guidelines and guardrails. There's only 2 disciplines in Alcoholics Anonymous. One is God, and the other is alcohol. You're either going for one or you're going for the other. That's why he says many times in the book, you're at the fork in the road. You're at the fork in the road. You can make a decision to go toward the light, or you can make a decision to go toward the darkness. But you will make a decision. Those are the only 2 that you have. We're not conscious of all of this, of course. We're coming from our inclination as a human being, which is for my will to choose me. I don't know that I'm doing that until I do know that I'm doing that. Step 4 is step 1 in writing. Step 4 is the identification of the darkness and the clouds in us that block us from the sunlight in us. And when we identify the darkness and take actions to reduce and remove the darkness, the light begins to shine in us, to us. And eventually, down the road, when we finish step 9, not only does the light shine in us, to us, but through us, so that we become lanterns to shine the light on the path so others can, in fact, address their darkness. We have to have God's help. So now he's going to address, well, what do we mean by that? Hopefully that question in this context will help you pursue pages 62 and 63 with a new consciousness. Look for the relationship. Look to reinforce my concept of alignment. This is the how and the why of it. His first statement, we have to quit playing God. Now, that's a in-your-face comment, black and white. I didn't know that I was playing God at 5 years of sobriety. I was freed from alcohol, a gift given to me before I ever came into AA, because I was willing to quit drinking to support my wife's recovery. But for those first 4 years, I suffered not from addiction, but from my unmanageability. And I didn't know that I was making decisions and taking actions from my self-centeredness. In my case, it was actually diagnosable. Sometime we'll be talking about the 9 characteristics of narcissism. That's where Bill asks us now to consider relationships. There are 5. The key, I believe, to completing step 3 is for you to identify the relationship that you want to have with this power deep down inside of you. What does your heart and your soul yearn for in a relationship? That word's not in the big book, but it captures in such a juicy way what I think step 3 is inviting us to. What relationship do you want to have that you decide to have in this particular time in your emotional and spiritual development? What relationship do you yearn to have with the light? Take a look at those promises as a meditation. Take a look at the prayer. And I really encourage you to make an effort to write your own 3rd step prayer, just so that you understand the one in the book. Thanks.